"Excuse me, but this line isn't correct," Jessica Carter said, her voice calm, yet carrying a sharp edge that immediately sliced through the murmurs of the crowded airport lounge. Travelers paused mid-step, their eyes flicking toward the tension that had suddenly filled the space, a mixture of curiosity and unease hanging in the recycled air. The fluorescent lights above reflected off polished tile floors, catching on Jessica's glasses as she adjusted them, her laptop bag swinging lightly against her hip. Richard Hayes, the pilot in crisp uniform with polished wings glinting on his chest, turned abruptly, his eyebrows knitting together in surprise and mild irritation. His voice, firm and authoritative, had earlier commanded attention across the terminal, but now it faltered slightly as he processed her statement. Around them, a few passengers whispered to one another, their expressions a mix of disbelief and intrigue, while the overhead monitors displayed gate numbers and departure times, flickering softly. Jessica, standing tall despite the rush of travelers, held a boarding pass in one hand, subtly tapping it against her palm, a signal of both readiness and confidence. The hum of the air conditioning and distant rolling suitcases seemed to fade as the moment crystallized, the air almost vibrating with anticipation. She had arrived early for her 10:45 a.m. flight, meticulous about schedules and timing, always checking every detail twice before making a move. Her dark navy blazer contrasted against the light gray of the terminal walls, and the sun streaming through large panoramic windows highlighted the smooth texture of her well-kept hair. Richard, accustomed to immediate compliance and minimal questioning, found his usual aura of control slightly compromised as Jessica presented a digital copy of the airline's confirmation email, fingers gliding over the screen with practiced ease. "See, the boarding sequence has you listed at Group B, yet the manifest shows a delay that doesn't align with the system's protocol," she explained, pointing at highlighted sections of text with precise, deliberate gestures. The surrounding passengers leaned subtly closer, sensing the unusual exchange, some quietly recording the moment on their phones, their faces reflecting a mix of admiration and anticipation. Richard cleared his throat, a faint sheen of perspiration forming at his hairline, betraying the internal calculation as he scanned her proof and cross-referenced it with his flight manifest. Jessica remained unflinching, her posture erect, eyes meeting his steadily without a trace of intimidation, a silent assertion that she knew exactly what she was doing. The hum of conversations in the lounge resumed in soft waves around them, yet the microcosm of tension between Jessica and Richard dominated the atmosphere, a delicate ballet of authority, correctness, and the poised resilience of a woman who refused to be diminished. With every passing second, the contrast between her calm and his mounting unease became more pronounced, the polished sheen of his professional composure slowly revealing the cracks of surprise and concern beneath. She gestured subtly to a clause in the confirmation that had been overlooked, her index finger tracing the line as the light from the terminal skylight caught the small gold insignia on her laptop, highlighting a sense of precision and professionalism. The seconds stretched as Richard's gaze flicked between her and the digital document, his mouth opening slightly, then closing as comprehension dawned, the immediate realization of potential consequences settling like a cold weight across his shoulders. Around them, passengers exchanged glances, some quietly impressed by the courage it took to confront a figure of authority, others captivated by the unfolding drama that had erupted suddenly and without warning. Jessica's lips remained pressed in a neutral line, her voice reserved, calm, yet unmistakably certain, every syllable measured, embodying a quiet strength that challenged assumptions and forced attention. The fluorescent lights overhead cast faint reflections on her laptop screen and polished shoes, a cinematic interplay of illumination highlighting the gravity of the moment. As she gently closed the laptop, her movements fluid and unhurried, the tension in the air lingered, a delicate, almost imperceptible pause that left Richard frozen, the pale color creeping into his features, signaling a profound recognition that the situation had shifted irreversibly, the balance of control momentarily inverted, leaving the audience of travelers suspended in silent anticipation of what would unfold next. Jessica stepped away from the counter, adjusting the strap of her laptop bag over her shoulder as she moved toward the seating area near Gate A12. The terminal was alive with the soft hum of conversation, the clatter of rolling suitcases on polished tile, and the occasional announcement over the public address system. Yet an invisible tension clung to her movements, the aftermath of her confrontation leaving a subtle ripple across the lounge. Travelers paused mid-step to glance at her as she walked past, their curiosity lingering in the air, their expressions a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. Yet Jessica remained focused, scanning the departure screens to confirm her boarding time. The sunlight streaming through the massive glass panes created sharp, bright reflections on the floor, highlighting the calculated rhythm of her stride and the confident tilt of her head. Richard Hayes, standing slightly off to the side, adjusted his jacket, a faint sheen of perspiration forming at his temples, his fingers brushing over the edge of the flight manifest he still held loosely in his hand. He watched her without speaking, his mouth pressed into a thin line, the color of his face pale under the bright overhead lighting. Jessica found an empty seat near the window, sliding her laptop from the bag with smooth precision and opening it to review her notes for the meeting she was flying to. The light from the screen flickered across her face, catching the subtle determination in her eyes and the soft arch of her brow as she typed quickly, yet deliberately. Around them, the sounds of the terminal continued unabated, the rolling of luggage, the soft footfalls of travelers, and the intermittent ringing of mobile phones. But in the microcosm of their shared space, the tension remained taut, a silent acknowledgment of the moment that had just passed. Jessica paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and smoothing down the sleeves of her blazer, her movements precise and purposeful, her calm demeanor contrasting with Richard's lingering unease. A young mother walked by with her child in tow, casting a quick glance at Jessica before continuing on, and a couple of businessmen whispered quietly near the coffee kiosk, their eyes occasionally darting toward the interaction they had witnessed. Jessica's fingers hovered briefly over the keys as she reviewed her agenda, her mind already planning the sequence of calls and meetings for the next day, her composure unbroken by the earlier exchange. Richard, still observing, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing at the boarding gate in the distance, then back at the digital display of passenger information, the realization of her correctness settling in with a slow, undeniable weight. Jessica adjusted the angle of her laptop screen, her movements fluid and intentional, tapping lightly on a highlighted section to review key details, every action precise, measured, and quietly commanding attention. The sunlight through the windows flickered across the polished floor and the metallic surfaces of luggage carts, creating a subtle shimmer that seemed to frame her as she worked, almost cinematic in its presentation. Richard's posture stiffened as he processed the situation, his mind racing through possible outcomes and the implications of the oversight he had nearly allowed to pass. The authority he normally projected giving way to the acknowledgment of someone who had not only challenged him, but had done so with clarity, competence, and unshakable calm. Jessica glanced up briefly, her gaze sweeping the lounge with an almost imperceptible nod to the flow of passengers, before returning to her laptop, the quiet hum of the device blending with the ambient noises of the terminal, a steady heartbeat under the surface of the unfolding scene, marking her as both ordinary and quietly extraordinary in the same measured breath. As Jessica settled into her seat by the window, she let her eyes drift across the bustling terminal, noting the movements of passengers weaving through the concourse, the glint of sunlight bouncing off polished floors, and the rhythmic hum of distant rolling luggage. She opened her notebook to review talking points for her upcoming meeting, fingers tracing the carefully written bullet points while the soft click of laptop keys punctuated the low murmur of travelers nearby. Richard Hayes lingered near the boarding gate, arms crossed, his posture rigid as he watched Jessica, with a mixture of lingering authority and cautious realization, the previous confrontation still reverberating in the corners of his mind. He scanned the surrounding area, the occasional overhead announcement echoing through the large terminal, yet his focus remained anchored on Jessica, who moved with deliberate grace as she adjusted her laptop, her dark blazer catching a sliver of sunlight and casting a faint reflection on the floor. Around them, a young man pushed a luggage cart, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished tile, while a family with a stroller navigated around a pillar, glancing subtly at the interaction unfolding without fully understanding its significance. Jessica's eyes flicked up momentarily, scanning the flight information monitors to confirm gate changes, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration, and then returned to the screen, her hands moving confidently as she typed, highlighting points and making quick notations that reflected both preparation and poise. Richard's face, usually composed and unreadable, betrayed a subtle shift in color as he replayed the exchange in his mind, the realization that the overlooked detail could have caused a delay weighing on him with quiet gravity. Jessica closed her notebook, her movements smooth and unhurried, and rested her hands in her lap, the soft light from the terminal's windows illuminating her calm expression, highlighting the quiet strength she carried into every interaction. Nearby, a barista adjusted the coffee machine, steam rising in thin columns that caught the sunlight, and travelers murmured softly as they passed, their focus alternating between their own tasks and the subtle tension still lingering near the gate. Jessica's gaze met Richard's briefly, steady and composed, and he looked away, exhaling slowly, acknowledging the unspoken correctness of her approach without uttering a word. The terminal continued its rhythm, the distant murmur of conversation, the rolling of carry-ons, and the occasional call for boarding. But the space around Jessica seemed almost suspended, her presence commanding attention not through volume, but through composed precision. She picked up her laptop bag again, sliding it over her shoulder, and moved toward the gate with a measured stride, her movements deliberate, eyes forward, yet every so often casting a subtle survey over the lounge, noting the reactions of passengers and staff alike. The sunlight shifted as clouds passed overhead, tracing patterns across the floor and highlighting the careful way she navigated the space, maintaining balance between speed and poise, confidence and courtesy. Richard observed quietly, making no move to approach, as Jessica reached the gate, swiping her boarding pass and glancing up at the digital display confirming her boarding sequence, her composure intact, her authority in that moment subtle but undeniable, leaving a quiet impression on all who witnessed the scene and setting the stage for consequences and acknowledgments yet to unfold. The air still charged with the echo of her quiet determination and the reverberating awareness that competence and calm could shift the weight of authority in unexpected ways. Jessica moved down the jetway, her footsteps echoing softly against the metal floor as the late morning sun filtered through the wide windows lining the corridor. She held her boarding pass with a relaxed grip, her gaze sweeping the interior of the narrow passageway, noting the reflections of sunlight on the stainless steel handrails and the shadows cast by the structural beams above. Each step was deliberate, her posture upright, her mind already shifting to the series of calls and presentations she would need to handle once on the plane. Yet she remained aware of the subtle energy lingering from her encounter earlier in the terminal. Passengers ahead and behind her exchanged brief glances, some nodding subtly in acknowledgment of her composure, while others whispered quietly, their expressions revealing curiosity tinged with admiration. Richard Hayes lingered at the entrance to the plane, adjusting the strap of his flight bag and straightening his uniform jacket, his polished wings catching the light as he observed Jessica from a distance. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of restrained authority and cautious acknowledgment of the accuracy she had demonstrated, the initial shock still visible in the slight paling of his complexion. Jessica slowed slightly as she approached the aircraft door, scanning the interior cabin, noting the neatly aligned rows of seats, the polished armrests, and the soft ambient lighting, all reflecting a serene order that contrasted with the brief tension that had just unfolded. She slid her laptop bag gently to the floor beside her, careful not to disturb the carpeted walkway, and allowed her eyes to travel to the passengers already seated, some settling into their seats with a quiet murmur, the hum of conversation and movement blending with the distant whir of the engines preparing for departure. Richard's hands rested lightly on the edge of the doorway, the muscles in his jaw tightening slightly as he mentally traced the sequence of events that had led to this point, the realization of her foresight and calm decisiveness weighing on him in a quiet, inescapable manner. Jessica adjusted the strap of her blazer, feeling the subtle shift of weight as her laptop rested securely against her side, and she stepped into the aisle with measured confidence, acknowledging with a subtle nod the flight attendants stationed nearby, their composed smiles recognizing the poised authority she carried without overt display. The sunlight streaming through the cabin windows illuminated the subtle textures of her attire and the gentle sway of her hair as she moved toward her assigned seat, each motion deliberate, projecting calm, focus, and an understated assurance that resonated in the confined space of the aircraft. Around them, the muted sounds of boarding continued, the soft click of seat belts, the rustle of papers, the gentle thump of rolling carry-ons. But in this moment, Jessica's presence created a distinct calm, a quiet gravity that subtly commanded attention without demanding it. She reached her row, lifted her laptop bag onto the overhead bin with controlled ease, and settled into her seat, smoothing the fabric of her blazer and adjusting her posture to face forward. Richard remained at the doorway, glancing once more toward her, eyes reflecting the lingering recognition of a challenge met and handled with precision. The subtle shift in his demeanor a silent acknowledgment that authority and accuracy could be influenced by composure, knowledge, and quiet confidence. Jessica exhaled softly, her mind already moving to the preparations for the flight ahead, yet her focus remained anchored in the awareness of her own deliberate agency. The moment a small but resonant triumph of preparation, attention to detail, and steady assurance that left an indelible impression in the shared space of the cabin. As the plane taxied slowly toward the runway, Jessica kept her hands folded neatly on her lap, her eyes occasionally flicking to the window where the city below shrank into a mosaic of rooftops and streets bathed in the morning light. She had positioned her laptop beside her, unopened for the moment, choosing instead to absorb the hum of the aircraft and the subtle vibrations beneath her seat, a rhythm that contrasted with the rapid pace of the terminal earlier. The soft rustle of passengers settling into their seats filled the cabin, punctuated by the muted beeping of screens and the distant click of seat belts being fastened. Richard Hayes, now seated in the cockpit area visible through the glass partition, glanced toward the cabin at intervals, his expression composed yet betraying a flicker of reflection, the earlier confrontation replaying in his mind as he adjusted his controls and reviewed the checklist for the flight. Jessica's gaze followed the patterns of the clouds stretching out across the horizon, their edges illuminated in gold by the rising sun, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet thought, the brief reprieve reinforcing the clarity and composure that had guided her through the earlier exchange. A child in the row ahead shuffled his backpack and whispered to his parent, the soft tones barely audible, blending seamlessly with the ambient sounds of the cabin, while a flight attendant moved gracefully down the aisle, offering assistance with a calm professionalism that mirrored Jessica's own deliberate movements. She took a subtle breath, feeling the slight tension of anticipation that always preceded departure, yet her posture remained relaxed, each movement measured and deliberate as her eyes scanned the cabin for familiar signage and indicators of the journey ahead. Richard adjusted his headset, the polished metal catching the light, and for a moment allowed himself to reflect on the manner in which Jessica had handled the situation with both accuracy and poise, her calm demeanor highlighting the contrast between her quiet authority and his previously unquestioned professional presence. The terminal lights cast a gentle glow on her face as she leaned back slightly, shoulders relaxed, hands resting lightly over her notebook and pen, the fine details of her attire illuminated by the cabin lighting, reflecting a composed and meticulous presence that drew subtle acknowledgment from nearby passengers. She observed a small family settling in across the aisle, the mother adjusting her child's blanket, and the father scanning his phone, yet Jessica remained attuned to the ambient flow, each sound and movement a subtle cue in the environment she navigated with care. The aircraft's engines began to hum steadily as the runway approached, a low vibration coursing through the seats and floor, grounding Jessica in the present moment and reinforcing the sense of controlled anticipation that characterized her every action. Richard's eyes shifted again toward her briefly, a nod of acknowledgment almost imperceptible, yet signaling an internal recognition of her quiet mastery over the earlier scenario, the interplay between accuracy, observation, and composed decisiveness lingering in the air. Jessica's fingers drummed lightly against her notebook, following a rhythm that matched the low hum of the aircraft, her mind reviewing the sequence of meetings, notes, and calls awaiting her, yet her focus remained anchored in the subtle dynamics of the moment, the calm she projected influencing the perception of all those around her in the cabin. The sunlight shifted slowly, casting gentle patterns across the seats and aisle, reflecting the movement of clouds outside and accentuating the controlled poise with which she carried herself, a presence that spoke to both competence and quiet authority. She leaned back fully, closing her eyes briefly to center herself, the low vibration and ambient murmur of the plane providing a soothing counterpoint to the earlier tension, reinforcing the awareness that the careful, deliberate handling of situations could subtly shift perceptions and quietly command respect without a word spoken. The plane leveled off into smooth flight, the engines emitting a steady, soothing hum that filled the cabin with a low vibration, a steady pulse that seemed to synchronize with Jessica Carter's calm breathing as she leaned back in her seat. Sunlight filtered through the windows, catching the edges of her notebook and laptop, casting subtle reflections across the aisle and illuminating her focused expression. She allowed her eyes to wander slowly over the rows of seats, observing fellow passengers quietly absorbed in books, phones, or hushed conversations, their movements blending into a gentle rhythm that contrasted sharply with the tension of the earlier confrontation. Richard Hayes remained visible in the cockpit area through the partition, his silhouette composed yet reflective, adjusting controls with measured motions as he glanced briefly toward the cabin, his mind processing the events that had transpired with a quiet, lingering awareness. Jessica's fingers traced the notes in her notebook lightly, following lines of text and reviewing key points with deliberate care, her movements precise and thoughtful, each gesture revealing a confidence born from preparation and self-assurance. The light shifted subtly as clouds moved across the sky outside, casting transient shadows that danced across the upholstery and aisle, adding depth to the quiet, contemplative atmosphere that settled over the cabin. Around her, the soft rustle of seat belts, the faint squeak of shoes against carpet, and the occasional whisper of passengers provided a backdrop of normalcy. Yet Jessica's presence imposed a silent authority, an unspoken recognition that precision, calm, and clarity could command attention as powerfully as any raised voice. She leaned back fully, allowing her gaze to drift upward toward the ceiling panels where the ambient lighting softly illuminated the space, the gentle glow accentuating the steady rhythm of the cabin and reflecting the balance of calm and control she projected. Richard's movements in the cockpit were subtle, adjusting dials and reviewing instruments with careful attention, yet the moments when his eyes flicked toward Jessica carried the weight of contemplation and acknowledgment, the earlier incident quietly informing his awareness and approach for the rest of the flight. Jessica allowed herself a slow exhale, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath her, a grounding presence that harmonized with the low murmur of passengers and the soft rustle of papers and laptops around her. Her posture remained poised, shoulders relaxed, hands resting lightly over her notebook, and her gaze alternated between her notes and the passing scenery outside, the subtle light of the sun reflecting off clouds and distant landscapes. The plane's steady hum created a meditative cadence that underscored the quiet composure of her thoughts, the interplay of light, shadow, and ambient sound forming an immersive tapestry that framed her in a moment of calm authority. Jessica adjusted her seat slightly, straightening her posture and allowing the notebook and laptop to rest comfortably on her lap, her eyes scanning and reflecting as she anticipated the tasks ahead, a quiet determination evident in every measured gesture and deliberate breath. Around them, the soft cadence of ambient noise continued, the occasional whisper of conversations, the clicking of devices, the faint murmur of movement. But Jessica remained anchored in her focus, a composed presence whose clarity and deliberate care radiated subtly through the cabin, leaving an impression of both competence and calm that reverberated quietly among passengers and crew alike, marking a serene, reflective interlude that held the tension of the day in suspension. As the flight settled into cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow over the passengers who now leaned back in their seats, some reading, others quietly talking in hushed tones, yet all movements coordinated within the steady rhythm of the aircraft. Jessica Carter remained upright, her laptop closed on the seat beside her, hands resting lightly over her notebook as she allowed herself to observe the subtle interplay of light and shadow across the rows of seats, sunlight filtering through the windows and reflecting in small patterns across the aisle. She adjusted her posture slightly, ensuring her back was straight, shoulders relaxed, and gaze steady. The calm poise she carried now influencing the subtle awareness of those around her. Richard Hayes, visible through the cockpit glass, shifted in his seat, checking instruments with careful precision, yet his thoughts intermittently returned to the exchange with Jessica, replaying her measured confidence and the clarity with which she had presented her points, the realization settling quietly that her composure had altered the dynamic of the earlier encounter in a way that demanded acknowledgment. The low hum of the engines provided a constant undertone, almost meditative, as Jessica's eyes briefly wandered to the passengers across the aisle, noting a mother adjusting her child's blanket and a businessman tapping lightly on his tablet, their minor movements highlighting the contrast with the poised focus she maintained. The sun moved higher, illuminating her dark blazer, catching on the subtle textures of her attire, and creating a gentle highlight along her hair and notebook, emphasizing the deliberate calm she projected without effort. Jessica allowed her thoughts to trace the sequence of tasks she would tackle upon arrival, mentally rehearsing her agenda, yet her attention remained anchored to the environment around her, the reflective metal of the overhead bins, the gentle sway of the aircraft in response to air currents, and the rhythm of passengers adjusting and settling into their own comfort zones. Richard glanced once more toward her, a subtle nod almost imperceptible, yet marking an acknowledgment, a recognition of her quiet authority that contrasted with the structured, procedural command he usually exercised in the cockpit. Jessica's hands rested lightly over her notebook, fingertips tracing the edges as her gaze shifted from the overhead compartments to the view outside, clouds drifting past with a soft, golden glow from the sunlight, the fleeting shadows adding depth to the serene atmosphere of the cabin. Passengers murmured softly among themselves, their attention occasionally flicking toward her presence, sensing without understanding the composed power in her demeanor, yet she remained fully absorbed in maintaining the balance of focus, anticipation, and calm. She adjusted the laptop bag on her lap, ensuring it was secure, and folded her hands over the top with precision, the small motions deliberate and measured, projecting a quiet confidence that required no verbal assertion. The aircraft maintained a gentle, steady vibration through the floor, reinforcing a sense of grounded calm, and Jessica allowed herself a brief exhale, her awareness encompassing both the internal rhythm of her thoughts and the external environment of the cabin, where passengers, crew, and the lingering presence of authority converged in a shared moment of suspended attention. The sunlight shifted again, highlighting subtle angles across her face and attire, creating a cinematic play of light that accentuated her poised composure, while Richard returned his focus fully to his instruments, the unspoken acknowledgment of her precision and competence lingering quietly between them, a silent testament to the shift in perception and the subtle recalibration of authority that had taken place in the shared space of the aircraft. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm as Jessica Carter carefully opened her laptop, the soft click of keys resonating subtly against the muted hum of the aircraft engines. Her fingers moved deliberately across the keyboard, reviewing notes and preparing to send updates for her upcoming meetings, each motion precise and measured, embodying a composed authority that contrasted with the earlier tension. Sunlight filtered through the oval windows, casting a warm glow across the rows of seats and illuminating the subtle textures of her blazer and the notebook resting beside her. Passengers adjusted around her, some leaning back to glance at the sky outside, others shifting quietly to settle more comfortably into their seats, yet her presence created a quiet gravitational pull in the aisle, a sense of calm competence that drew attention without demanding it. Richard Hayes, visible through the cockpit partition, adjusted his headset and glanced toward the cabin once more, his eyes lingering on Jessica with a mixture of acknowledgment and reflection, the earlier confrontation replaying in his mind with a growing appreciation for her clarity and poise. Jessica paused briefly, taking a slow breath, her eyes scanning the digital display of flight information before returning to her notes, tapping lightly on a highlighted section, the rhythmic movements steadying her focus and reinforcing the sense of control she carried. The sunlight shifted slightly as clouds passed overhead, creating fleeting patterns of shadow across the carpeted aisle and soft, glinting reflections on the armrests, a visual accompaniment to the measured pace she maintained, every gesture deliberate yet understated, projecting authority without overt assertion. Around her, the gentle murmur of conversation and the occasional clatter of rolling luggage created a backdrop of normalcy. But in the microcosm of the cabin, the air seemed charged with subtle recognition, a quiet acknowledgment of competence and resilience that did not require spoken words. Jessica leaned back slightly, smoothing her hands over the notebook and allowing herself a moment to center, the low vibration of the plane beneath her feet, grounding the space and reinforcing the balance she maintained between external observation and internal focus. Richard returned his attention to the instrument panel, his posture composed yet subtly shifted, reflecting a mental adjustment, an internal acknowledgment that authority and influence could be measured, not only through position but through precision, composure, and the quiet exercise of knowledge. The soft ambient lighting of the cabin highlighted the contours of her face and the edges of the laptop, the reflections creating a cinematic interplay of light and shadow that accentuated the poised serenity she carried into every movement. Jessica's gaze wandered briefly to the passengers around her, noticing a mother adjusting a child's blanket, a business traveler reviewing documents, and a young student with headphones immersed in music, each observing their own space, yet unconsciously absorbing the steady presence she projected. She adjusted the strap of her laptop bag slightly, hands resting lightly on top as she allowed herself a subtle exhale. The hum of the engines, the filtered sunlight, and the ambient murmurs blending into a harmonious backdrop, reinforcing a sense of calm control that permeated the cabin. The acknowledgement of her competence seemed to linger quietly in the space, an unspoken recognition of the balance between knowledge, preparation, and the composure to maintain authority without assertion, a subtle but profound influence that extended beyond words and left a lasting impression on all who shared the moment in the confined, sunlit environment of the aircraft. Jessica Carter's eyes followed the soft arc of sunlight streaming through the cabin windows as the plane began its gradual descent, the city below unfolding into a patchwork of streets, buildings, and green spaces shimmering in the late afternoon light. She leaned back slightly, the gentle vibration of the aircraft beneath her feet harmonizing with the rhythm of her breathing, a sense of quiet triumph settling in her chest. Around her, passengers adjusted their seats, some peering out at the descending landscape, others gathering belongings with subdued efficiency. Yet in the small pocket of space Jessica occupied, the atmosphere held a distinct, almost palpable weight of resolution. Richard Hayes, seated near the cockpit controls, glanced toward the cabin one final time. The subtle tension in his posture softened into a quiet acknowledgment, a recognition that the earlier confrontation had revealed not challenge, but insight, precision, and unwavering composure. Jessica's hands rested lightly on her notebook, fingers tracing lines of ink as though the act itself anchored her awareness, reinforcing the steady focus that had guided her through the sequence of events from terminal to sky. The soft murmur of conversations, the shuffling of feet, and the faint rustle of paper provided a serene backdrop, underscoring the contrast between ordinary activity and the quiet gravity of the moment she had quietly commanded. Sunlight flickered across the interior, catching the glint of metal on overhead bins and armrests, highlighting the contours of faces and clothing, and casting gentle shadows that moved across the aisle with the shifting angle of the plane. Jessica adjusted her laptop bag slightly, resting it securely on her lap, the motion deliberate, reflective, and measured, signaling an enduring awareness of her surroundings while maintaining the calm poise that had subtly altered the perceptions of those around her. Richard, adjusting his headset, allowed a brief moment for reflection, considering the events with a thoughtful pause. The earlier tension transformed into quiet recognition that authority could be both tested and reshaped by careful observation, knowledge, and unwavering composure. Outside the windows, The city's grid passed beneath in an array of light and color, the shifting sun painting buildings and streets with streaks of gold, orange, and soft white, a cinematic backdrop that mirrored the quiet resolution in the cabin. Jessica exhaled slowly, feeling the steady hum of the engines and the muted vibration of the plane beneath her, her thoughts aligning with the rhythm of the descent, poised and deliberate. Passengers around her continued their preparations for landing, adjusting personal items and checking devices. Yet the presence she maintained conveyed a subtle authority, the impression of competence and grace lingering like a quiet signature in the shared space. She allowed her gaze to drift to the horizon one last time before turning inward, centering herself as the plane began its final approach, the gentle tilt of the aircraft and the soft whine of the engines reinforcing the sense of calm control she had carried from the terminal to this moment. The light shifted again as clouds passed across the sky, the fleeting shadows dancing across seats and aisle, a visual echo of the quiet shift that had taken place between her and Richard, the acknowledgment of skill, accuracy, and composure that required no words but resonated with unmistakable clarity. Jessica's posture remained poised, back straight, hands resting lightly over her notebook, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the descending sun, an enduring presence of calm, capability, and quiet triumph that left an indelible impression on the cabin, marking the subtle but profound closure of the day's events, the final moments before the plane touched down, and the unspoken acknowledgment of respect, clarity, and composure that would linger long after the engines had ceased their hum.